Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's fourth space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Crosstalk of the Senses, Meet the Authors. This is part of the Uncommon Senses 5 conference. And to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from fourth space. We are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge, co-creating daily activities that examine research questions, projects, things happening across the university. We're also running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting. So for those of you joining us on Zoom, we welcome your comments or questions via the chat. We could read those out later during the Q&A. And for those of you in the space, if you have a comment or a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone over to you so that everyone can hear. With that, it's very much my pleasure to hand the microphone over to full professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, as well as the co-director of the Center for Sensory Studies here at Concordia, David Howes. David, it's great to have you.
Thank you very much, Douglas, for having us in fourth space. This is an honor, and we're very, very pleased to be able to be coming to you from fourth space. Now, if I can just direct your attention to the slide, it shows the cover of a book. It's a cover of one of my books, and it's called The Sensory Studies Manifesto. Now, people say that you can never, or you should never, judge a book by its cover, and I agree, but you can judge a book by its color. And this is an example. This is the most beautiful color in the world. It's a Provençal yellow. And let me just translate that color into some other modalities. It is a warm color, Provençal yellow. It's neither hot, like red, nor cool, like blue. It is as smooth as silk. You could stroke that cover and it would feel silken. It smells like lavender, and that's because Grasse, the world capital of perfumery, is located in Provence. And so, you know, the smell of Provençal yellow, it must be that of lavender. It tastes like maple sugar candy, but that's just me. I'm a Quebecer. To me, maple sugar, maple syrup is just the best taste in the world. Others, you might think it's more like a vanilla smoothie, and you're welcome to your opinion. It also has a sound. Provençal yellow has a sound. It's really the most beautiful chord you can imagine. But we were having a dispute here over what that chord is, so I'm going to leave that open, okay? But what is the most beautiful chord you think? It matches Provençal yellow. But this session is not about me, and it's not about my book. I have the privilege to have invited 4 authors who are in the vanguard of the sensorial revolution. And I've presented them with the challenge not of presenting their own book, as often happens in a Meet the Author session, but rather to present their partner's book, as it were. And so we're going to start with Jeremy Stolow commenting on Polina Dimova's At the Crossroads of the Senses, and then Polina will be presenting her thoughts on Jeremy Stolow's Picturing Aura. Now, Jeremy is a professor of communication studies here at Concordia, and he is a member in good standing of the Center for Sensory Studies. Picturing Aura is his latest book, and he's currently embarked on an SSHRC-funded project on color therapy. So expanding the whole idea of color therapy in the same depth as he's done with Aura. Polina, you will know from her keynote yesterday, she is at the University of Colorado, and she is the author of At the Crossroads of the Senses, an extraordinary book looking at the notion of synaesthesia and how it provoked some intense conversation in the arts and sciences in the fin de siècle. So we will begin with Jeremy, and I will introduce the other two presenters after Polina and Jeremy have finished.
There, it's good. Oh, yes. Thank you, David. And thank you, Polina, for your amazing talk yesterday, which stole most of my thunder. I hope this will be a useful set of thoughts. I thought about rewriting everything last night and began and in despair said, no, I will stick with what I have, which really came out of a reading of this incredibly rich book, which for those of you who haven't yet had a chance to encounter it, at the Crossroads of the Senses is a major intervention in multiple fields, among others art history, cultural history, history of science and medicine, and of course sensory studies, which we are gathered to contemplate in so many ways at this incredible conference here these days. And it was really a great pleasure to read this book, but also quite a humbling exercise to try to assemble some comments about such an incredibly rich and detailed study. The book combines synthetic discussions of the history of neurology, physiology, and the sciences of perception in the 19th century with close readings of a series of major artists, poets, and composers who populate the modernist canon. And in these ways, Dimova's book stands at the cutting edge of scholarship that brings together science and culture in innovative ways, focusing in this case on synaesthesia, the name we give to a cluster of phenomena that this book teaches us cannot be contained on either side of the nature-culture divide. Dimova deftly navigates this fraught territory, establishing synaesthesia's centrality within a dizzying range of artistic and cultural forms. And along the way, she also offers some delightful analyses of some of the material affordances of high modernist multimedia performance arts, such as in the case of Richard Wagner's stage productions, Alexander Scriabin's color light organ, or Charles-Émile Reynaud's praxinoscope, in each case opening up questions about instrumental agency and technological infrastructure that also happen to establish this book's relevance for media archaeologists to bring the discussion somewhat closer to my own disciplinary home. In short, as I read this book, I learned a great deal, and I certainly wish I had the opportunity to have perused it before I completed my own book on the history of aura visualization, since it's much clearer to me now how often I invoked sensory modalities and cultural forms that were in fact synaesthetic. And it now makes me wonder how and to what effect the term synaesthesia might have led me to redescribe a range of things that I address in the books, among others, a trope that I call in the book tactile vision, which is a recurring topic where I try to address some of the ways that invisible vital forces and subtle life forms are registered and then translated into pictures, often with the help of technologies that are understood to operate as instrumental corollaries of a gifted clairvoyant seer. Can one go so far as to suggest that visualization media are never simply visual, but rather always operate to work and produce things synaesthetically? What's gained by adding the term synaesthesia here? I don't yet have an answer to that question, but I've really enjoyed the provocation to think about this. There's a number of achievements of this book, but one of the greatest ones, I think, is that it forces the reader to appreciate how wildly complex is this phenomenon we call synaesthesia, and how tensely contradictory have been its various definitions, which are pressed into competing accounts of something that is either acquired or innate, something that is either a token of primitive cognition or refined genius, something imaginary or real. Chapter after chapter of this book addresses these tensions, where cross-sensory experiences operate sometimes as physiological characteristics, at other times as figurative building blocks for artistic experimentation. The book provides a detailed and extremely helpful account of the efforts of 19th century physiologists, neurologists, and psychologists to integrate diverse experiences of sensory cross work, such as color, hearing, or tactile sounds, into a coherent scientific theory that eventually comes to fall under the name synaesthesia. And parenthetically, let me flag here one other virtue of this book, namely its treatment of source material in multiple languages, including French and German, but also Russian. And that allows Dimova to introduce the reader to scientific literature that's much less well known to Western audiences, such as the work of the Russian physiologist Pavel Sokolov. And on that basis of alone, Dimova's book makes an important contribution to a larger project aimed at parochializing Western Eurocentric histories of science, showing us how knowledge doesn't simply radiate unidirectionally from metropolitan centers such as London and Paris, but actually circulate in complex multidirectional ways. The greater part of the book, however, is devoted to weaving these discussions about evolving scientific debates into studies of the place and role of synaesthesia among successive avant-garde artists and cultural workers of this same period of roughly the sort of 1870s to the 1920s. And indeed, the book considers a remarkable range of artists and works spanning that period, including, among others, the composers Richard Wagner and Alexander Scriabin, the poets Charles Baudelaire, Oscar Wilde, Rainer Maria Rilke, Andrei Bieli, the painters Vasily Kandinsky and Franciszek Kupka. As somebody with no training in the methods or debates that form this tradition of scholarly inquiry into the modernist canon, I don't have a great deal to add to these discussions other than to underscore how much I learned from Dimova's discussion and how much I felt myself in the hands of a trustworthy and erudite authority. But the task falls to me here in this unusual setup that David has called upon us to say something more than just words of praise. And so let me use the remainder of my time to comment on a couple of things that I felt the book left me wondering about. Although I will admit that my preoccupations are somewhat self-servingly directed at the kinds of problems that I grappled with in my own research and writing of my own book. And hopefully these are of use to others as well. The first comment I wanted to make concerns the way that this book gives such attentive focus to high modernist art, as opposed to other domains of cultural activity that might have had, perhaps we could say, a broader social purchase during this same period, and which I suspect might have proven to be just as informative about the legacy of synaesthesia as a sensory mode and a cultural technique. And I'm thinking here about a range of sort of more, we might call them lowbrow genres, such as popular science demonstrations, vaudeville performances, theatrical phantasmagoria, magic shows, or for that matter, the birth of cinema, which all likewise seem to involve the same kinds of intermediate relationships and multimodal sensations that we find in the experimental poetry, painting, and music of the likes of Wagner, Rilke, and Kandinsky. In saying this, I don't wish to rehearse what has by now become a rather tiresome and sterile debate about high versus low popular or high versus popular culture. And it's worth pointing out here for those who aren't familiar with the book that the book opens with a coda it ends with a coda where Dimova takes up some of these very issues in a very thoughtful commentary on the legacy of the Frankfurt School, in particular the work of Adorno and Benjamin, who provide accounts of consumer culture, urban spectacle, and mechanized factory production that were centrally concerned with the formation of what we might call synaesthetic subjects in capitalist modernity. But very little of this work sort of weaves its way into sort of the central focus of the book, which is to sort of more closely organized around these more canonical figures of high modern art. And this leads me to wonder about what the book the kind of discussion about synaesthesia might look differently if these highbrow artworks had been placed into more sustained conversation with these more popular forms of cultural production. And I make this point painfully aware that it's really the laziest form of criticism to talk about what books don't cover or what is not in a book, as opposed to addressing what is really at hand and what the author has actually tried to address in the writing that we have in front of us. But perhaps, if nothing else, I'm trying to express how generative I think Dimova's treatment of synaesthesia is, not just for our understanding of the history of modernist art in its multiple forms, but also as a methodological model and I think an exemplary study for future work that might even further broaden and multiply the scenes of cultural production where this trope of synaesthetic sensation is so operative. My second and final comment is prompted by the subtitle of the book, which reads, "A Synaesthetic Metaphor Across the Arts of European Modernism." Now, I don't know how this subtitle ended up on the cover of the book, although I'm willing to guess that the publisher itself had a hand in this, as they often do, pushing authors to acquire or adopt subtitles that are more geared to the purposes of finding the book through keyword searches and other marketing techniques. But nevertheless, it's curious and perhaps revelatory to see the word metaphor appear here once again, which brings us back to the enigmatic promise of this book, namely to call into question the status of synaesthesia as a phenomenon that somehow perhaps cannot be contained within commonplace distinctions of nature and culture, physiology and imagination. An ungenerous reading of the subtitle might suggest that Dimova has somehow lost her nerve by the end of the project, ceding authority to the professional biomedical gaze, which confidently locates the ground and source of synaesthetic experience in neurological hardwiring, and treats all other accounts of a phenomenon as allegorical or a product of some kind of cultural projection, the things that metaphors do. But some of you already know Dimova is keenly aware of this potential pitfall and works quite hard to avoid falling into it throughout the book. For one thing, the book opens with a list of 20 theses on synaesthesia, which, far removed from the prescriptive tone of Martin Luther's famous 95 Theses, are meant to prepare us for the book's staging of a wild romp through competing and even irreconcilably opposed attempts to define and delimit the topic at hand. And even although Dimova does not herself always so explicitly tell us how she wishes to treat this question of science as opposed to the culture of synaesthesia, I think her book provides ample reasons to infer a different interpretation of the subtitle, which would begin by conceding that metaphors are never simply metaphors, or to put it in the deeply unfashionable Derridian terms, that metaphors are only ever metaphor of metaphor. As technologies for navigating sameness and difference, of making different things recognizably comparable, metaphors are neither strictly objects of thought or action, and their power is more than simply documentary. Instead, metaphors work operationally or performatively, or to play on the etymology of the term, the Greek word metapheren, which means to carry across. We might even say metaphors are a kind of transportation technology, and as such they need to be explained in terms of the work they do within and between local contexts of operation. This kind of radically contextualist and pragmatic approach might also be relevant for understanding the work that synaesthesia likewise performs, where different sensory registers become crossed, translate into one another, collaborate, compete, or tensely coexist, moving in ways that cannot be mapped according to the tidy conceptual divisions of nature and culture, or of mind, body, and environment. At the risk of being too coy, let me suggest that not only might we think of synaesthesia as metaphorical, but metaphors as synaesthetic. Whether in the controlled conditions of the laboratory, the hallowed spaces of performance arts, the interior landscapes of mystical contemplation, or the virtual spaces of multimedia spectacles, we might be able to see comparable dynamics of perception and sensation, action and meaning at work. And if I dare speak on behalf of us both, I think this is precisely the problem that Dimova's book, both Dimova's book and my own book, try to grapple with in different ways. I don't doubt I'm the only one who will find this a very productive book to think with, and I really believe you'll be well rewarded by reading it. So thank you, Polina, for the amazing work that you did and for this gift.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for that in-depth and very all-encompassing presentation of Polina's book. And so now I hand the microphone to Polina to comment on picturing aura.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Jeremy, for the wonderful, stimulating discussion of my book. It gave me a lot to think about, a couple of other articles to write, perhaps. And thank you, David, for bringing us all together for this amazing event, the Crosstalk of the Senses. So I will talk about Jeremy's book. I think I'll have 5 points. I'll be talking about aura ontology, the multisensory aura, aura and synesthesia as occult or unseen phenomena, and then our methodologies, and then I will add some specific intersections of aura and synesthesia. So, over the past couple of months, I've lived under the spell of the aura as reimagined by Jeremy Stolow in his fascinating book, Picturing Aura. Expansive, provocative, and illuminating, Jeremy's book has not only opened my eyes to the hidden light of auras, but also revealed to me new ways of thinking about science and its others. I loved his brilliant insight of shifting our critical attention away from questions about whether auras exist or not in some ill-defined objective reality. Instead, Jeremy focuses on what auras are, what they look like, and how they're enacted. He explores the ontology of auras and examines, quote, the history of picturing aura as a practice, a family of materials, tools, techniques, performative repertoires, and iconographic references that migrate from one side to the next in the aura's global trading zone of science and occultism, and this is another term Jeremy uses. Stolow identifies the aura's signature iconographic elements, its billow and its glow. In the aura's image bank of subtle bodies, energies, and matter, we see the ubiquitous halos of Christian saints and of Buddhist bodhisattvas and the billowing garments of Botticelli's Birth of Venus. These dispersed, glowing, and billowing images traverse cultures and time, east and west, with no clear point of origin, Jeremy notes. You can't place it in one, it is so ubiquitous, you can't place it. While Picturing Aura focuses on auratic visualizations, aura, Jeremy reminds us, is a multi-sensory phenomenon that can be experienced visually, sonically, thermally. It thus intersects with synesthesia. In addition to pictures of aura, we could research its full sensory experience, its touch, smell, sound, and taste, thus contributing to sensory studies. In fact, if we think of synesthesia as an experience of aura, as many occultists did, and as I now do after reading Jeremy's book, multimedia technologies and art can help capture the aura. Both aura and synesthesia are occult or unseen phenomena, so synesthesia and aura studies necessarily intersect in both their fringeness and their entanglement with science, mysticism, and art. Similarly, the interest in both surged at the turn of the 19th century, marking the heyday of both aura and synesthesia. The decisive shift in aura studies, Jeremy tells us, came with the rise of new visualization techniques and instruments around 1900, as photography and electrography promised to reveal previously unseen energies. Yet both aura and synesthesia were disregarded and diminished by science for most of the 20th century as illusions, hallucinations, deception, or trickery. Synesthesia has only recently been rehabilitated by science after fMRI images verified it as a real phenomenon. Perhaps the aura too awaits the legitimate instruments to picture it and its vindication. However, Jeremy's work is so iconoclastic and brilliant precisely because his fringe phenomenon has not yet been assimilated into science. While I can afford to embrace synesthesia's artistic, mystical, cultural, and neuroscientific aspects, he has no choice but to make sense of the quote-unquote rejected knowledge of aura. In terms of methodologies, both books grapple with a staggering number of heterogeneous sources and approaches to treat multifarious resemblances. I unified them by using Walter Benjamin's concept of constellations and constructing 20 theses on synesthesia, as you heard. For me, synesthesia is a constellation of discourses, technologies, media, artworks, and felt experiences that have emerged in my terms and the mystical scientific discourses of modernity. Stolow unifies his approach by defining aura as a boundary object and a cosmogram, concepts that could likewise describe synesthesia. According to Susan Starr, quote, boundary objects occupy liminal spaces in between different communities of practice and frameworks of interpretation. Projit Mukherjee's cosmograms are the distinctive constellations of materials, agents, objects of depiction, and ways of seeing that enable particular disclosures of the cosmos. Or pictures and iterations further pass through a series of trading zones interconnecting scientists, inventors, photographers, esoteric philosophers, healers, artists, celebrities, and many other actors. I even cut some of the ones that Jeremy mentioned, and this is precisely what Jeremy was talking about earlier. I wish my book had all these aspects, sort of more popular culture, more lowbrow culture. It doesn't, but this is what makes Stolow's book so amazing. I admire Jeremy's work for studying the intersections of Eastern, Western, sort of North and South depictions of auras and the global exchanges and colonial appropriations of aura images as they move from center to peripheries and back. We encountered Japanese scientists, Tomokichi Fukurai, thought photographs, or Nensha, and the Brazilian priest and inventor Roberto Landau de Moura's electrographic translations of sound into light in his wireless telegraph and telephone. But perhaps the Soviet Kirlian photography device holds the greatest fascination in Jeremy's study. Brought to the West by parapsychologist Thelma Moss, it entered science, psychedelia, public wonder-making, and entertainment as seen in a film featuring Kirlian photogram stills running to the sound of the Grateful Dead, Ravi Shankar, and the Beatles, or in the Kirlian photographs of David Bowie's fingerprints. So you can see the auras coming out of his fingerprints, David Bowie's. Thus, the aura infiltrates popular, celebrity, and digital culture, and there is now even a trend of aura selfies. Jeremy, do you have actually an app? You probably have an app. Maybe we should all have our...
There are about 7 or 8 different apps for aura photography. So you have boundless options.
Boundless options there. And finally, it's not finally, I still have some material to cover. I'll now note some specific intersections of aura and synaesthesia in our books. We're both fascinated with technologies used to occult ends. First, we share an obsession with electricity as a spiritual or occult energy. For Jeremy, electricity allows for erratic visualization and occult revelations in electrograms, corona discharges, and Kirlian photography. In my book, electricity is a manifestation of spiritual love in the material world. It anticipates the mystical transfiguration of reality and enacts all unity in the interpenetration of sounds, colors, and lights, thanks to Scriabin's color organ. We're both fascinated with visualization and multisensory technologies, and Jeremy often reminds us that scientific visualization instruments perceive in similar ways to mediums and clairvoyance. In my book, it is the artist who claims to possess synaesthetic, that is, clairvoyant vision. Kandinsky records synaesthetic vibrations. Rainer Maria Rilke compares the poet to a phonograph that expands our perceptual capabilities with the quote-unquote five-fingered hand of the senses. Like the occultists with their photographs and electrograms of hands, Rilke is obsessed with hands as synaesthetic sense. And here I gesture towards protactile, perhaps the most synaesthetic of languages. Finally, in our books, future technologies promise to create motion pictures of auras, as in the polycontrast interference photography, or enable synaesthesia with the color organ. Next, Jeremy's book helped me envision another of my theses. So I'm going to keep adding theses until I reach 95. Synaesthesia, I'd suggest, is the perception of aura. In an example I had to cut from my book, Louis Fuller featured in my book, it was cut. So there are so many more auras there that you just didn't even read about. So in an example I cut, the Russian writer Andrei Bely reported feeling the colors or tones of his personal relationships. His experience has been associated with clairvoyance. The theosophist Helena Blavatsky likewise describes synesthetes as sensitives who can perceive auras. She recalls a Russian girl who saw her mother's caressing words as blue, her piano melodies as beautiful rainbows, and her aunt's piano playing as fireworks and stars. But sensory perception of human auras may be a manifestation of synesthesia, current research suggests, and in your epilogue, in the appendix, you can say, okay, that's another sort of way in which we're not going to think about auras. So Saitovic discusses Richard Seitowik, about whom I talked yesterday, discusses several cases of aura perception in quote-unquote emotionally mediated synesthesia. One synesthete saw a woman surrounded by a dark blue-green aura caused by strong feeling. For another synesthete, yellow people are extroverted. Bubbly people have bubbles in their synesthetic auras. In my experience, one synesthete had a very positive impression of me since my aura was fuchsia or plum colored and had a pleasant, soft, fuzzy texture. To a Berkeley friend of mine from grad school, my persona and my name with its initial P evoked a pleasant lime green color. You can now re-envision me. Both of our books also suggest that it is possible to teach how to perceive auras and how to perceive synesthetically. Jeremy's energy practitioners give detailed instructions on how to shift or distract your attention and soften your gaze, noting that feelings of discomfort and peaceful atmosphere around people reveal perception of auras. So you have all felt auras before, you just didn't know it. Scriabin's Prometheus and Kandinsky's stage composition Yellow Sound hope to transform us into synesthetic listeners and viewers, I suggest. As I mentioned in my keynote yesterday, one could achieve acquired synesthesia through meditation, hallucinogenic drugs, sensory deprivation, or states of deep absorption. I will conclude with our shared fascination with Walter Benjamin, whichever you call him, with a nod to semiotics and the tradition of orthodox icons not made by human hands, archaeopoiesis, which is how Jeremy describes it, but it also exists in the Russian tradition. For Jeremy, Benjamin's notion of the aura is crucial for understanding the occult power of photography and electrography. Both seem to be products of autonomous, miraculous, spontaneous creation by uncreated light, netvarny svet in Russian, or divine touch. Kirlian photograms make present the electrical discharges of aura in their synesthetic tactile vision by direct touch of the occult. Benjamin's auras thus collapse space and time, creating the, quote, appearance of semblance of distance, no matter how close it may be. It is like the cast shadow of a branch. The shadow is its indexical or iconic trace. In this model of the aura, Jeremy suggests the eye and the skin work together synesthetically to evoke the aura's distant presence. Implicit in my book is also another model for the aura in the synesthetic echo of the past that Benjamin finds in Baudelaire's correspondences with its scents, sounds, and colors gathered far away. This temporal synesthesia, that's how I call it in my book, creates the aura. And this is my new suggestion, my 22nd thesis now. Rilke's archaic torso of Apollo, another of Benjamin's favorite poems I discuss, also reflects on Benjamin's aura concept. Rilke's archaic statue recalls a distant past, yet strikes us with its immediate present, intensified by the multi-sensory memory of Apollo's earlier synesthetic remediations. To add a final new thesis to my 20 thesis, synesthesia, I suggest, creates the aura of the artwork in a multi-sensory echo of its past adaptations. So thank you, Jeremy. Your book was a real treat, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Polina. And I know many questions will have arisen from these two presentations, but I ask you to hold on to them, and we will have time at the end to address your questions. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our second pair, which consists of the blind-deaf poet, writer, and activist, John Lee Clark, who is the author of Touch the Future, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. John is a student in the interdisciplinary PhD in Humanities program here at Concordia. He was awarded the biggest, most prestigious entrance fellowship we've got. But in accepting it, he had to turn down other fellowships that were even more lucrative, that would have taken him to universities in the States. So we're very thankful for him to have chosen Concordia, where he is working with Erin Manning, who is the director of the Sense Lab. And I actually had the pleasure of John taking one of my courses last fall, and it was a source of great instruction to have him in the class. I'd also like to introduce Lida Zeitlin-Wu, and she is currently at Old Dominion University, but will be moving come the fall to the University of Notre Dame, and will also be taking up an ACLS, postdoctoral fellowship, or is it postdoctoral? A fellowship, okay, but the honor of an ACLS fellowship upon moving universities. Congratulations on that, by the way. And okay, we are going to start with Lida, who will offer her appreciation of John's book, which turns on the notion of distantism, a very helpful, a very useful concept. And that will be followed by John offering his reflections on a concept that Lida is problematizing in a singularly compelling way, and that is colorism. So here we have two isms, but they're not your usual isms, like sexism and racism, capitalism. It belongs with sexism and racism. Not one of those, but taking us in a whole new direction. So we will begin with Lida, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Is this, everyone can hear me? No, thank you so much for this opportunity. I think it's really one like no other. And so I'd just like to begin with a word of gratitude to John. This was a horizon expanding reading experience like no other. So thank you so much for putting this work into the world. And I'll admit that I found myself overwhelmed and intimidated at times while crafting this response to such a rich text that melds creative nonfiction with poetry, with political manifesto, with academic criticism, and ultimately asks the reader to do away with these distinctions. So hopefully what I offer here does your work justice and pushes the conversation in new directions. And so what I'll begin with in response to what David outlined is what did John's work and critique of distantism teach me about colorism in my own work? And after that, I'll kind of move towards the potentially sort of world-bending and revolutionary ramifications of protactile, specifically in the context of our intensely individualized sort of late capitalist culture. So, can you touch color? What does it feel like? Does it give off heat, or is it cool against your fingertips? Does green feel different, coarser or rougher than red? Or does color as tactile experience remind us that the division of the spectrum into linguistic categories has always been culturally constructed? The visual artist and critic David Batchelor writes that, unlike form and shape, the visual experience of color cannot be verified by the other senses. We cannot touch color, even though it constantly surrounds us and we are in some ways touched by it. So Batchelor's statement is a perfect example of what Clark terms distantism. That is, in his words, the privileging of the distant senses of hearing and vision that reinforces an existing sensory hierarchy where touch is often shunned as taboo, too intimate. And in many ways, Batchelor's distantist reading of color is a missed opportunity, since color has historically been the site of so many experiments in synaesthesia, as Polina's work, of course, attests to. My own fascination with color began decades ago with Vladimir Nabokov's writing, specifically what he describes in his 1951 memoir, Speak Memory, as his own personal rainbow, where letters of the alphabet correspond to specific colors. Now, given that Nabokov himself calls this colored hearing, it's easy to overlook that texture, shape, scent, and taste actually play no small role here. So you get wonderful phrases like the unripe apple of P and creamy D, M is a fold of pink flannel, while hard G is vulcanized rubber, and L is noodle limp. Can we really still say that we can't touch color? But color's relationship to disability is nearly always discussed in terms of visual acuity, specifically colorblindness. And in turn, this leads to questions about access, of how to design PowerPoint slides, web pages, and maps with what are called colorblind-friendly palettes. And at this point, maybe it's worth admitting that this is a rare occasion for me to give a presentation without images, and I feel almost naked without them. And of course, the sensation of absence or lack is in some ways the epitome of distantism. Is it a coincidence that several of the most targeted critiques of accessibility in Touch the Future have to do with color? Clark mentions a participant in one of his seminars parodying the often self-defeating nature of image description. So here's the parody. Mary is wearing a green, blue, and red striped shirt. Every fourth stripe also has a purple dot the size of a pea in it, and there are 47 stripes. So color here seems purely decorative. It communicates information, but it has no meaning. In another instance, Clark describes interrupting an interpreter whose level of descriptive detail reduces a human being to a set of color-coded empty signifiers. Here's the description. Walking by over there is a tall, thin, light-skinned person with curly dark hair down to here, wearing a white tank top, blue jeans, and brown boots. And as Clark notes, the interpreter is pleased that they've avoided race and gender. Not too long ago, my co-editor and I were asked by our publisher to provide alt text for several hundred color images in our edited volume, Color Protocols, Technologies of Racial Encoding in Chromatic Media, which looks at the historically fraught relationship between color and race in the context of media, primarily in the United States. Having no experience in creating alt text, we quickly found ourselves in disagreement where my co-editor wanted to use descriptions like light-skinned rather than white and dark-skinned rather than black. She was concerned that using racialized terms for color would reinforce the very colorism the volume was critiquing, this kind of essentializing nature as color as a stand-in for race. By contrast, I was adamant that we include racial descriptors when they were central to the image's purpose, and argued that eliminating them perpetuated the so-called color blindness of I don't see color. And there isn't time to go into this here, but we could probably spend hours discussing why a disability has become a metaphor for a kind of obliviousness or willful ignorance about race. So after much discussion, my co-editor and I agreed that pretending race didn't exist in alt text only served to perpetuate a fantasy of objective or impartial transcription, which Clark repeatedly critiques in Touch the Future. He reminds the reader that attempts to replicate hearing and sighted experiences for deafblind people nearly always backfire. Why would we want a representation of a representation of a representation of something, he challenges? Why not a tactile representation of that something, bypassing visual representation altogether? So instead of hearing and sighted people trying to make accessible to deafblind people a world that isn't built for them, why not design a new world that throws traditional sensory hierarchies out the window? Now here I can't help but think of another chromatic artistic experiment, Derek Jarman's 1993 film Blue, which shows nothing but a static blue screen accompanied by a dynamic soundtrack and voiceover by Jarman. And the blue is specifically Yves Klein International Blue, which post-war French painter Klein mixed from synthetic ultramarine, but it also invokes the no-signal error display of a blank or non-functioning TV screen. The film was released shortly before Jarman's death from AIDS and offers a meditation on sensory loss as he recounts going blind due to complications from the disease. It can't be denied that despite its focus on disability, this is a film primarily for hearing and sighted people. At the same time, Jarman's narration also breaks away from distantism with phrases like, "Blue transcends the solemn geography of human limits," and "The virus rages fierce. I have no friends now who are not dead or dying. Like a blue frost it caught them." He waxes about the warmth of the blue heat haze, blue of my heart, blue of my dreams, and the slow blue love of delphinium days. Sound and sight seem incidental here compared to touch and feeling. A little known fact about the film is that Blue was initially released in 2 formats, one for film and one for TV and radio, to be broadcast simultaneously as a collaboration between BBC Radio 3 and Channel 4. Those without color TV sets could order blue index cards in the mail, which they were then meant to hold and stare at while listening to the radio broadcast. Now, sighted viewers who have seen this on film on a big screen might be quick to dismiss this as a quaint, pale, and dated substitution of the film. But I also can't help but think of Clarke's description of a pro-tactile version of the card game Uno called Textures and Shapes, where the wild card is, as he describes, a delightful eruption of fabrics. Color is texture and shapes. A glossy metallic surface feels different from an unpolished one, and the rare pigment made from ground lapis lazuli is a different creature entirely from the acrylic paint squeezed from a tube that bears the same name. What would a pro-tactile version of blue look like? As Clarke writes, instead of asking, how can we make it accessible, let's start asking, what feels beautiful? So as I start to wrap up here, I want to move away from color and talk about capitalism, although as I explore in my own work, these two are intimately entwined. And I was especially struck by this one sentence from the essay from Touch the Future titled The Texture of Visual Touch. And here's the sentence. Capitalism loves distantism because it replaces community with consumption. So let me just repeat that. Capitalism loves distantism because it replaces community with consumption. Protactile, as Clarke writes, is the only language in existence which it's impossible to speak alone, as this event attests to. At least one other body has to be present, and there are no interpreters, but rather co-navigators. By definition, it's a language of community and proximity, hence why, as Clarke notes, social distancing during the pandemic only highlighted the deeply entrenched tendencies that were already there. When reading Touch the Future, I found myself constantly oscillating between what came to mind for me when I heard the word tactile or haptic versus the bodily and emotional contact of the protactile that the book describes. Silicon Valley's incessant rationalization and monopolization of the senses means that haptics have become wholly divorced from the communal. As Clarke points out, there's a profound irony that touch has become such a fundamental way of engaging with devices that have no textural variation. From using biometric fingerprint recognition to log in to a device in lieu of a passcode, to typing on a keyboard with no buttons or keys to speak of, these screens are cold and flat. They can be touched, but they're not tactile or protactile. The vibration and tapping of an Apple Watch reminds the user to take more steps, to respond to that work email, to work towards an impossible ideal of self-regulation where they must turn increasingly inward. This neoliberal cult of efficiency seems to me the very opposite of protactile, which Clarke distinguishes from simply tactile. This is a matter of, quote, not merely feeling something, but both feeling it and being felt by it. Protactile isn't just a language, but a new form of world building where all are welcome to join in if they can dispense with what they think they know. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed reading this.
Thank you, Lida, ever so much for that appreciation of the implication of John's notion of distantism.
That are making me think, so I appreciate the fun in that.
And so we move to John engaging with a work by Lida, a work in progress, which will be out later this year, turning on the theme of how color became a technology. And so now we turn it over to John, commenting on this notion of colorism as problematized by Lida and her collaborators. John.
Thanks ever so much, David. I also want to thank Lida tremendously for her thought-provoking response. They are very good questions. I'm going to sort of get to them in a very roundabout way, if you'll allow. I enjoyed everything that I read of yours. It's impossible to summarize adequately, so I'm going to do my very best to get to what impacted me and what I think can be laced and traced onto my own work. The reason for that being that it's very dense, and I just want to make sure that I'm being clear. When talking about capitalism and all that touches and all of that finds its way in, it really is about, like, I'm literally, in order to get the concept across, squeezing my co-navigator's forearm because because capitalism really does suck you dry, as it were. And so I think of that in terms of colorism and what you're bringing about, because you're referring to black and white, and I'm thinking about how capitalism really drains the color out of one entirely. So I want to, so in that sense, I want to talk about how it kind of reminds me of a biopsy, whereas color is color, or thinking of color as a gridlock presentation of the different colors that might be available to you. It really is taking a biopsy, taking one thing in isolation out of its context entirely, so that you can then consume it, which divorces it from the context in which it exists in, the interpretive element. When we look at a color, we interpret it within everything that is presented along with it, to pretend that you can mine it out only and isolate it and determine what it means to you in isolation from everything else is a representation of a representation of a representation, and divorces us from our own interpretation. So and so your work did that very well in terms of talking about the post-war and how colorism became more popular, and thinking about it like, oh, this is a perfectly okay practice. We can look at a grid of a bunch of different colors, and we can pretend that the individual is empowered to pick a color that they like. But it completely strips away, or washes away the complexity of that process.
And it makes it seem as if there's personal choice involved, when it's been
And gives the
constructed
illusion
by-
that there's personal choice where there is none, because it's been curated for you. And how capitalism has profited off of that exercise, and done more harm by pretending that the individual is empowered by making a personal choice, when really the choice has been made for them. So there's a lot to think about, and there's a lot that's been problematized. The idea that picking color is an expression of character, of personal individualism, when really it's been completely obfuscated in the pursuit of capitalism. For example, choosing the color of a car, and what does that say about you? Well, what do you think it says about you versus what does the manufacturer want it to say about you? I'm going to turn now to a quote that I found that I'd love read, that's from your piece, please. The first quote, would you mind?
Absolutely. Though this consumer could, in the case of color, select from a range of individualized shades, the fact that these options were dictated by a chart of predetermined color standards spoke more to the illusion of choice than true customization or variability.
So appreciate that. There's a really important point there as it relates to how color is gendered, how color plays upon gender dynamics, and reinforces the dynamic that best serves capitalism. And not only gender dynamics, but also racial dynamics, how it is predominantly white focused, how it is predominantly focused on tones that are pleasing to white folks, whereas anyone that falls outside of that convention is promptly ignored. And I think now we are leading to the second quote I pre-prepared.
Only white Americans of a certain means have the luxury of being individuals, an individualism that could be expressed through color in fashion, interior design, and screen media.
Thank you. So that's heavy to think about how that seeps into everything that we're talking about. And we think about how it steps or seeps into all different kinds of fields, and how it's ubiquitous in its problematization in so many different areas. And I think about the codes that are assigned to every single color, how even that becomes more machine, more code. Now we're representing something that's supposed to be impossible to represent, but with a number, with charts that makes it easier to put it into a chart, and therefore makes it more marketable. And
to influence our mood.
it serves many different purposes. One being mood. So, if you want to be at peace when you're at home, then we're going to sell you these colors. But if you have another reason or another mood that you're after, then we'll sell you these colors. And so it becomes a controlled environment rather than a naturalistic one, an organic one that you discover. No, the environments you're entering have been designed for a specific purpose. And so it becomes manipulative because you're getting all of these subliminal signals based on decisions that were made long before you entered the room. What's meant to be communicated to you has been decided, and your individual choice, your individual ability to interpret what you will is being removed of you. When I think about color, I'm getting to answer your question now. I cannot touch color in the way that you're asking, or in the way that sighted or that sighted people can. Mm-hmm. However, because of course I can't tell what I'm touching when I touch something with color, but I do want to differentiate between the physical attribute and what else color can communicate, and I think about how we nounify or verbify words in order to understand them better. So the noun, the color as a noun, is not something I can perceive. Color as a verb is something I can perceive. It is
how my life experience is colored by different experiences, different textures.
My life is influenced by different textures, by different colors, so I exist and feel influenced by different colors as I navigate through life, whether that's through texture as well, but it's always in concert and in combination with other things. The color is accompanied by typical sounds, typical smells, typical textures. So it does make me think about what we were referring to before, thanks to Polina, in terms of synaesthesia, because it's not, as I was saying before, not divorced from its context. yellow, red, green often appear in similar contexts. And so I experience those full contexts.
Each color is also influenced by my experience of smell, sound, etc.
And each color is enriched by the experience of smell, of texture, and all the other senses. So that's all working in concert, one iteration and another. I do not experience color as its own unique, separate, isolated thing, but I do experience it as within the symphony of other things that it comes about with. I'm thinking about, there is from 1960s.
The 16th century.
Sorry, interpreter error. The 16th century, a gentleman who would study objects and think about them in different ways,
Robert.
by the name of Robert Hooke, sorry. And I have a quote from him, and I'm going to have you read it up.
He discussed the list of variable qualities an object under examination may possess, quote, sonorousness or dullness, smell or taste, gravity or levity, coarseness or fineness, fastness or looseness, stiffness or liableness, roughness or brittleness, clamminess or slipperiness.
Thank you. So I enjoy how he differentiates between different
And is a multimodal.
between these different words, and it makes it more clear the multimodalness. So it brings to light the idea that you can hear or you can feel what you might perceive to be meant for a different sense, but it is always possible to come to a color through a texture or come to a sound through color. I think about yellow, and I think of it as, well, yellow, smooth yellow or soft yellow. I can't stop at the color. It's not comprehensible to me if I only consider the color. But yellow can be brittle, yellow can be smooth. And to bring it back to what Lida was talking about, the grid doesn't allow for that. It completely isolates it from anything else that accompanies it, and therefore is meaningless to me. But it's always more interesting to say, well, this shape that I'm handing you is yellow, but this other shape I'm handing you is also yellow. And now we can have a conversation. Are they different yellows? Yes, they are different yellows. Oh, okay, this is interesting now. So that's an interesting activity for me, but not because of the color, but because the color exists in two different contexts. And that is an interesting activity in order to play and to touch and to
With the textures of each of those objects as well.
engaging with those textures in those two different objects is part of what makes that activity so fascinating. Again, just to make it sure that I'm being clear, isolating a color on its own and expecting any meaningful interpretation a worthwhile exercise.
And it's exactly a great example of distantism.
And it's a perfect example of distantism. Daniel Stern talks about infants who are very young and how they absorb their world around them synaesthetically. And Erin Manning discusses in her work how it's over time that infants learn to differentiate and compartmentalize, that some of the information you're Absorbing is sight. Some of it is sound. Some of it is touch. And so it is a learned distantism that an infant learns to distinguish what used to be all synaesthetic in one experience. So they literally experiencing distantism within themselves because that's what is enculturated into them by society. So there is a quote related to that. I believe, correct?
Mm-hmm. In the event, in the language we speak, between and in excess of words, there's an intuition of a coming to content that is more than the form of its communicability. This vision, as Bergson might call it, is a direct experience of dynamic form, a swelling, a surging, a bursting, an accelerating, a fading, a fleeting, a moving with. This dynamic form in the events unfolding has, quote, no pre-imposed modality and is not a direct cognition. Stern 2010, page 8.
Thank you. So when thinking about an object and the object as content, and what has to come about in order to form it, with one's eyes open, you can see its current state, but not its history. Whereas if you were to perhaps perceive the object with eyes closed, and therefore tactily, you might then understand, oh, I see the story of this object. I can feel how it's shaped and changed over time, which may not be readily evident to you if you're only perceiving it through your eyes. I really appreciated Lida's take on, because it was so very clear how the capitalist process and how that's parallel to distantism. I appreciated that overlay. It got me excited. And it's, I believe, a very important point. And color is definitely impacted because it's in the ecology of everything. And I'm going to wrap up shortly. But again, Erin, if you don't know, she makes rugs, and she was very excited to make some what we call PT rugs, protactile rugs, for some PT users. She wanted to see whether she could make something that was meaningful to all of us, and so she got to work on that. And she sent them out to a bunch of us, myself included, and we really enjoyed the tactile experience of what she had made. But what was fascinating is that, well, I mean, in her regular practice, Erin Manning likes to incorporate a lot of color into her rugs. But there was one rug that she made of the 3 that she's eventually mailed out, which she tried to focus less on color and more on tactile experience. So trying to deviate away from her normal practice and try to create something that was especially for the audience to which she was sending these rugs. And I remember when it was my turn to get all 3 rugs, she asked me, what do you think of them? What's your favorite? And I had a good time with one. It was an enjoyable experience. There was one that not so much. And the third was also stimulating. And I let her know, you know, there's one that's like not great, but I'm not sure why. It's this one. And she said, that's the one that I specifically made with no color that I really wanted to have be something more than. So that led to a really fascinating conversation of like, what is it that is, in addition to color being removed, there's something else that's being removed, because why else would it be less stimulating than the ones that have color for someone who doesn't perceive color in the same way as others? So that's a fascinating discussion, and it just brings home this idea of like, what we think we're isolating color. We think we're only talking about color, but it accidentally or intentionally carries with it so much more than just the shade, the tone, and the color as it would. Color brings with it so much more information that could be rendered tactilely if it's a rug. That makes it that much more rich.
And that the color infused the rest of the experience of the rug.
And so the color infuses and enriches the experience, not just through color, but through whatever else it is that it's bringing. And so I hope that has been clear. I'll finish there. Thank you so much.
John, thank you so much for teaching us how to approach the world as something other than a color chart, for breaking up the monopoly of Pantone and the monopoly of the Munsell color chip in such a compelling way, and making us feel all that gets excluded in the commodification of color, such as Lida has been analyzing. This is what we mean by crosstalk amongst the senses. That's the subtitle of this session, bringing authors with very different preoccupations together to speak about each other's work. Synaesthesia and aura, distantism and colorism, and out of the contrast effects, arriving at another whole way of perceiving and understanding the world. Thank you so much to the participants in this session for so generously giving of their own time to engage with the book of another and advance the conversation. So we have about 15 minutes that we can devote to questions. And so I'm happy to open the floor for questions. And I also, encourage the panelists to ask questions of each other. You've raised such interesting questions about each other's books and what you've taken from each other's books. But let me just sort of make one comment before turning it over. And that is that we have seen here an example of protactile in action. And what is so compelling about this form of communication is that it involves feeling and being felt. Okay, John both feels his co-navigators and is felt by them. That is so different from the experience of reading a book, which is unidirectional. Okay? You see the book, but the book does not see you. And indeed, one of the things I think we've been touching on in all of these presentations is absence of reciprocity. And I will come back to that, but isn't that the essence of capitalism? The absence of reciprocity, the separation out of colors, the commodification of everything, a kind of essentialism. How do we restore reciprocity? Which is also the question of how do we restore multisensoriality in the way in which John has described, where color isn't abstracted. Color goes along with other senses. How do we recontextualize color? Capitalism isn't going to do that for us. We've got to do it ourselves. We've got to liberate ourselves from the prison house of capitalism. But enough. Please, anyone who would like to address a question, okay? Anyone who'd like to put a question, please.
I'll just bring a microphone over. Also, just wanted to mention for anyone joining us on Zoom, if you have a comment or question, you could pop it into the chat and we could read that out.
Thank you. Thank you for a great panel. I have a question for John, and my name is Sachi Sekimoto. I teach at Minnesota State University in Mankato, and I know that you come from Minnesota, so it's such a pleasure to meet you here in Concordia. And I read your book, and it was such a treat to listen to the response on this panel as well to the book. But I'd like to kind of extend the question you addressed about how blind people or deafblind people might perceive color. And because my current interest is in the air, I'm interested in the relationship between the air and body or the embodiment. And I'm curious if you could comment on how you perceive air as a protactile communicator, and what role air plays in your methods of communicating and perceiving the world. Thank you.
Fascinating question. I have two thoughts. The first being related to protactile as a language, as being quite distinct. When we talk about sign language, we often talk about airspace, which is literally what spaces are your signs taking in the air, and are they taking up too much? Are they taking the appropriate amount of space? Sort of like framing. And you might point to something in orientation of airspace, like the door's over there or the washrooms are over there. So you talk about your utility of airspace as a grammatical function. Protactile does not use airspace. We use contact space. Those who are learning protactile tend to quote unquote cheat as they're learning, and they use airspace, and we have to constantly remind them that it has no meaning. Using airspace when you should be using contact space sort of makes the meaning more difficult to extract. But using contact space is a whole different exercise. We do still use it. It inserts itself. For example, if you wanted to talk about how windy the day is, or I mean, I'm having a mask on now, so forgive me if you humor me. Like I can, if I didn't have a mask on, I would breathe in order to communicate different concepts, different meanings, whether it was that I was having a good coughing day or a bad coughing day, or whether it was windy outside or not so windy.
So our phonology within PT does involve literally the use of air.
So the phonology in protactile literally does use air. It does express itself occasionally in protactile, but it is not riddled with it. I, for example, might use my co-navigator's arm to use to convey the concept of a tree, but I'm not going to blow on his hand to show that it's windy. I'm going to grip his hand and show what a tree does when it's windy. So that's maybe a different way of executing air that might be surprising or might be unique to protactile and contact space. So that is a very, very good question. I think I got to both things rather in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. You did indeed touch on all of the points. Other questions from the audience or from the panelists, please.
Hi there, thank you very much for this wonderful crosstalk. I just had a question for you here about the auras. I've been sort of studying and looking at auras for a project I'm working on, and as far as I see, it feels like they're quite sort of human-centered ways of, they're always about the human. And I wondered, in your research, have you come across any practices or examples of auras where they're not pertaining to the human subject, but to other subjects like plants, minerals, animals, or even materials?
Is this on? Yes. Thank you. Well, in fact, botanical specimens play an enormous role in the history of aura visualization. And maybe in part because many of the techniques, the visualization techniques involve direct contact, and like hands or feet, plant leaves have the advantage of being flat. So they have a large contact surface. They're, and yet have like lots of interesting topography and lots to be able to explore. And then also there's a kind of a common thread in much of sort of attempts to visualize auras that think about part and whole. So the relationship of the hand to the body becomes, which is so crucial for many non-Western forms of medical practice, such as acupuncture or other forms of diagnosis of the human estate, where the hand becomes particularly rich source of information about other things going on in and beyond our bodies, and the leaf likewise, the leaf of a plant likewise has a lot of keys to the existence of plant specimens. So I think there's something very interesting about the ways in which that translation happens. Parapsychologists, there's a kind of a history of parapsychologists interested in botanical specimens as sort of keys to life processes and trying to find some hidden architecture. So there's a kind of a neo-vitalist thread that shapes a lot of the research that is done around some of these questions. But I think they also come up in many forms of popular culture where we think of the human aura. And you're right, it's very human-centered and in many ways very conservative kind of notion that, you know, everybody has an aura and somehow we're very individualized. But somehow through this, I think there is this kind of desire or an impulse to sort of try to find some deeper key to the cosmos that will open up, will extend beyond our bodies and bring us into these larger threads that connect the world. And somehow, you know, sort of our plant-like existence and the living the living aura that we find in plants, these become like really interesting points of contact that shape both some of the researchers that are invested in this search for auras and also kind of a more popular cultural and even artistic preoccupation with the idea that all living things radiate.
If I may, I'd just like to pick up on one of the questions that Jeremy raised of Polina's book, the use of the term synaesthetic metaphor. And Jeremy sort of took it in both directions. What about metaphor as synaesthesia? What about synaesthesia as metaphor? And that was an interesting sort of mixing up of the two categories. But I want to emphasize that what I think was brilliant about Polina's use of that term was precisely that she committed a heresy, okay? Because there is synaesthesia proper, and the neuroscientists will tell you what that consists of, and then there is pseudo-synaesthesia, when somebody is just talking metaphorically, okay? And don't confuse the two. They have tests to determine whether somebody is a synesthete or not. And in their experiments, they don't want non-synesthetes. They don't want pretenders. They don't want people who are just speaking metaphorically. So imagine how a neuroscientist is going to bristle at the title of Polina's book, Synaesthetic Metaphor. Oh, it's going to be like, you know, nails on a blackboard for them. So it's an irritant, but it's precisely, you know, that conjunction which I think, you know, might be able to create the kind of back and forth that you're describing. And so I just wanted to ask, you know, Polina, you know, this term, synaesthetic metaphor, it's a calculated term. What do you hope it will accomplish?
Well, I probably will have to repeat a little bit of what I was talking about yesterday. It is the intermediary. It's precisely what should be going between neuroscience and psychology and the arts and the humanities and the social sciences. because if, again, I mentioned it in my talk, neuroscientists believe that synaesthesia is at the sort of at the basis, or it's at the origin of metaphor. That has been mentioned in so many articles and books on genuine synaesthesia that, I mean, it's considered an accepted fact. And this is why I brought Tuan's article yesterday, because it basically says, so there is true synaesthesia, there is this weak synaesthesia or synaesthetic tendency, then there is metaphor. And then after that, there is a symbolic space. So basically, there are these degrees, and synaesthetic metaphor is right in the middle. And this is what I'm trying to accomplish. And again, that's why I have like the 20 theses. I steal the neuroscientific definitions, I come up with my own, I use some old definitions, I bring everything together, and in the middle is the synaesthetic metaphor. So this was the idea. And I have to say that my book, although it's been written and published, it continues, unfortunately, to develop in my head. And I did talk about some things yesterday that are not in my book. So, but the synaesthetic metaphor is just precisely the intermediary, what can negotiate, what can mediate between experiences and all these different fields.
So instead of the binary, synaesthete, non-synaesthete, true and pretender, okay, it's precisely this idea of a transitional object or something, precisely this idea of a meeting ground where there could be a conversation that you have so artfully introduced into the discussion. May it be, an abundant conversation. May it develop in all the directions that you wish. We have time for one last question. And John, please.
My question was for you, Lida. So I was curious, you've researched so much about the color grid, but of course that doesn't encompass the entirety of your research. I was curious if you were looking into other forms of colorism, color representation. What are other ways that color has been represented? I'm thinking, for example, related to AI and the development that's going on there. I'm wondering if you could give us a brief synopsis, if you would mind, describing some other ways that color is being represented that is involved in your research.
Sure, that's a great question. So the book in progress, how color became a technology, the making of chromatic capitalism, the way that I've structured it is through these different predominantly visual paradigms that have been historically used to represent color. And so I'm sort of trying to, maybe it's a little overly ambitious, but I'm sort of going all the way from Isaac Newton to today and trying to have some sort of through line about what happens to color under different stages of capitalism.
Excellent.
And, are there surprising moments of rupture, continuity? So the way that I have organized it, even though of course there are many ways, and it's not to just say, with this new moment, this previous model goes away. But some of this was in the chapter you read, but this kind of rupture between the color wheel, which really supposes a kind of continuity and blending between different color intermediaries that was the most used kind of more in the Enlightenment all the way until maybe the late 19th century, where you get this emergence of the industrial color grid, which is all about, as you said, cutting up that spectrum into discrete shades that can then be labeled, numbered, and then sold to the consumer. And of course, that's tied to different kinds of industries, not just the synthetic dye industry, but also emerging fields of psychophysics. I talk a little bit about how that grid format was also used in the history of race science. But that grid is kind of, in a way, a predecessor to the kind of computational grids that we see with something like Photoshop, which you can click on what looks like a gradient, but actually it's really a grid, because what you've done is the user has clicked on a precise point which corresponds to a particular numerical code. So as to how that relates to AI, that's a huge question. I have been doing it's not in the book, but I did publish an article recently about AI colorization. It's a very much just kind of more of a kind of exploration of what this technology might do. I mean, I should say I'm overall, like I'm very, very critical of generative AI, but I wasn't necessarily interested in just sort of saying, you know, this is bad. I was really interested that there are now tools where someone can upload a black and white photograph, and these deep learning tools will colorize it. And so these use something called general adversarial networks, which I'm not, you know, well versed enough in computer science, but basically the gist is it's a training model that is there's like a way that eventually the algorithm gets smart enough, right, to be able to predict statistically what is the most likely color. So I found that interesting kind of on I think it actually maybe relates to these conversations around aura, because what is it that's gained when you have a black and white photo and you've been told, oh, you're bringing your ancestors to light? These are mostly, I mean, they're used for different reasons, but mostly on these genealogy ancestry platforms. There are all these, I think, very creepy deep learning tools where similarly you can animate a photo of your ancestor. And so immediately I thought, like, right, is this not just spirit photography again? But if we're thinking about Benjamin's concept of the aura, I felt like adding color to these photos, it feels like it's rewriting the past, but it also feels like, wow, that is really just zapping the aura out of the thing. So I don't know that that's really an answer, but I feel like that's a kind of recent example of like, something is happening to color with this generative AI model, which is a little bit different. And yeah, I guess that's all I'll say about that.
Thank you very, very much. I just want to make two notes in closing. One is that you will have picked up on some delicious wafts of fragrance, and they are emanating from the next event in this space, fourth space, which we are very grateful to occupy. The next event here is a modal olfactory atmospheres or experiential design of olfactive environments by Jayanthan Sriram, who is in the same program, the interdisciplinary humanities program here at Concordia as John. And I invite you to sort of engage your noses in the exploration of the environments that Jayanthan has created. The final thing I'd like to suggest is that if you could please put John's hand on the table. Okay, thank you, John. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for coming in today. Also, thank you for your questions. Those of you joining us on Zoom, we'll be closing up the Zoom and the live stream now, but just know that this conversation remains available on our YouTube channel. You should revisit it, share it, and stick around for the workshop, those of you here in the space.